Let's go over to the top. Right?
Oh,
Oh my god, that's you. Are you freaked out for everything?
my cousin Laura. This is for the white children. We are sitting.
Let's
It's not too big, this auditory. Thin, huh? Just go and say it. Okay. This is nice and comfortable, but when you sit back, you cannot see the people.
Yeah, I
This is
think
too high.
we're too short for these to benefit.
But no, it is too, because this is too high.
Do you want us then to?
No, I'm okay.
That's more than the fun.
Yeah, no.
Much for coming. This is our first lecture in what we hope will be a series on Islamic psychology or Islamic integrated psychology and Muslim mental health. As we have seen, as we've been researching in this area, there is a great need for this. We had a workshop earlier today, and one of our participants brought up an alarming statistic, which is that there has been almost a fourfold increase in rates of clinical depression within Qatar alone over the past 4 years. This is really remarkable. So, by the way, if you are suffering, know that you are not alone, and that there are people who are aware of this. And this is something where there is a definite need within both Qatar and the broader Muslim community. In addition, when we look, we see that there are certain questions that contemporary psychology and psychotherapy, there are certain questions that they do not fully answer, and many people within these fields are aware of that. We feel that within the classical Islamic tradition, there are modes of interpreting the human condition, of understanding the human condition, and the subtleties of our relationships, of our inner lives, that we have a lot to contribute to over the 1,400 years of our tradition. And this is the beginning of it, and we hope that, inshallah, we are able to develop a program that meets these needs both within the Muslim community and the international community. Because after all, Islam was not sent as a rahmatan lil muslimin. This is not what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran. It is rahmatan lil alameen. It is, in a sense, a responsibility that we have as Muslims to bring these teachings not only to ourselves, but to the rest of humanity. Now, without further ado, I want to welcome the new Dean of the College of Islamic Studies, Dr. Rajab Santurk. For those of you who don't know him, you will know him soon. He is everywhere. In just 4 years, he established the University of Ibn Khaldun and did incredible work. And we are now witnessing how he did that. And he's bringing new vision to every facet, not only of the College of Islamic Studies, but to broader HBKU and to many programs within Doha. And this program in Islamic psychology is just one of those. Dr. Santurk, please come forward.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I wish all of you good evening. Thank you very much for coming over, and I'm here just to thank you and greet you. In particular, I would like to thank our speakers. We have two distinguished speakers coming all the way, from America and Turkey. Dr. Human Keshavarzi. He's a well-known psychologist, and Dr. Khalida Zamzami, he came all the way from America only for 1 day, just to be present in our workshop and to give this talk. We are really grateful to him, and I thank Dr. Joseph Lombard for his generous introduction. This talk or this event is part of a series we call Foresight Talks. Foresight Talks, where we are heading to as humanity, as Muslim Ummah, and as Qatar society. Where are we heading? So we decided that we organize a series of talks about foresight. And foresight in Arabic, what's foresight in Arabic? firase, 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 like seeing the future, trying to see the future. Inshallah ta'ala, there will be more talks in this series, and today we will explore the future of psychology from Islamic perspective. We have two important guests. They will be discussing this, and inshallah this will be the first step towards opening an Islamic psychology MA program under CIS. Inshallah ta'ala, please make dua that we succeed in doing this with the support of our guests. Once again, thank you very much for coming over, and I hope you will enjoy these two talks by these two distinguished scholars.
Now, our two scholars, they are definitely working in tandem. They're actually going to give us kind of one talk, which has kind of two parts, so alhamdulillah. So I'm going to introduce the two of them together so that we don't have a break in the flow, inshallah. So beginning with Dr. Khalida Zamzami. He is a psychology fellow a fellow of the Institute of Living in Connecticut in the USA, and he received his medical degree from Ain Shams University in Egypt and completed his psychological residency here in Doha at Hamad Medical Corporation. And he also received an MA here in our ethics program, where he specialized on Islamic perceptions of suicide. And then Dr. Human Keshavarzi is a licensed psychotherapist in the state of Illinois, and he holds a doctorate of clinical psychology, a master's of clinical psychology, and a bachelor's of science with a specialist in psychology. And he is currently assistant professor at Ibn Khaldun University. And he is also the founding director of the Khalil Center in the United States, which is the first Islamically integrated institute for psychotherapy in the US. And it is now the most widely known, with centers in Chicago and California, as well as several other places across the states, and Toronto as well, which is really, mashallah, an amazing service. So without further ado, please come forward.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Such an honor to be here. This is where I studied. This is where I graduated from with my master's in Islamic studies while I was doing my psychiatry residency training at Hamad Medical Corporation a few years ago. So we are talking about three domains here: past, present, and future. And I'm going to talk about the past, and Dr. Human is going to walk us through the present and the future. And I'm going to start with a few questions here, and I want everyone in the audience to raise your hand if you agree with any of these statements. Do you agree that if you are a Muslim and you practice your religion, you will never suffer depression? If you agree, please raise your hand. Do you agree that suicide is less common among Muslims than other religious groups? Please raise your hand if you agree. Do you agree that a doctor can encourage their patient to pray because prayer has a healing effect? Do you agree that beating your kids if they don't follow the deen, the religion, is Islamically encouraged to help them grow as religious practicing Muslims? I see some hands raised. And that's a multiple. And the last one here is a multiple choice question. How many times do you think the word huzn, sadness, or any of its derivatives was mentioned in the Quran? Anyone? For around 10 times the word huzn in the Quran, sadness, that emotion. Anyone for around 25 times in the Quran? I see some hands. Anyone around 40 times in the Quran? I see many hands. Now, you might expect me to give you the answers to these questions, which I'm not going to do. But I'm going to revisit these questions at the end. But every question of these touches upon an aspect of Islam that interacts or intersects with an aspect of psychology. Each of these questions touches upon a topic of Islam and a topic of psychology, and the intersection of both and the interaction of both. And that question of Islam and psychology is something I've been thinking about for a very, very long time. And that, for me, started in, and that's a timeline I'm going to use for the rest of my presentation here, started for me in 2007. And as Dr. Lombard said, I graduated from Ain Shams University in Egypt. I was attending my first lecture of psychiatry at a Muslim majority country the largest Arab Muslim country in the Middle East, Egypt, at one of the largest medical schools in Egypt, Ain Shams University, and sitting in my first lecture of psychiatry with a very, very prominent psychiatrist in Egypt. And in that first lecture, he said very disrespectful remarks about religion and its connection to mental health, and made derogatory comments about how Muslims turn to prayer when they feel depressed, how they turn to dua and Quran for healing when they are anxious. And he argued that there is no connection between mental health and religiosity. Now, back then, I was a very young, passionate, student. I used to attend medical classes in the morning, and then in the evenings, I go to the masjid with the shuyukh and so on. So I was shocked to attend a lecture in psychiatry in a Muslim country, and a Muslim professor is speaking, and they are making these remarks about the connection, or rather the disconnection between religion and mental health. So I wondered, and I asked myself whether I got really confused. I wondered if psychiatry and religion do not mix, if all psychiatrists hate religion, if psychiatry as a field has no place for religion. And I started asking myself the question whether this is new or old. And if it's new or old, how new or how old? And my realization was that this is not new. He was not saying something that no one before had said, but it was not too old neither. And that led me to try and explore and go back a little bit. So if you go to 1879, that's the date that you read in the books of psychology for the establishment of the modern field of psychology. And it started with a German psychologist, Wundt. And from that moment onwards, psychology established itself, or wanted to establish itself, as a scientific field. And in a scientific field, they felt that there's no place for religion or metaphysics. And it reached a point where they made antagonistic, some of the prominent early psychologists and psychoanalysts made very remarkable comments about religion and religiosity. And some of them described religiosity as a universal obsessional neurosis, for example, described God and religion as an illusion, for example. And it seemed that the field was adopting this notion by the National Academy of Sciences in a statement they released in 1984 that said religion and science are separate and mutually exclusive realms. So I realized that what he was saying is not new, but is it old? Is it too old? So I started digging deeper to see if that has always been the case. And then I decided to explore our tradition, the Islamic tradition, to see what did our tradition say about psychology and mental health. And then I came across this 3-volume publication called علم النفس في التراث الإسلامي, or Psychological Sciences in the Islamic Heritage. And just to give you an idea about this 3-volume compendium, it summarized 300 books or treatises written by Muslim scholars, 100 Muslim scholars, starting with Ibn Sirin, who died in 729, ending with Abu al-Ula Afifi, who died in 1966. So summarized 300 books and treatises written by these scholars in these 3 volumes that spanned almost 1,500 pages. And when I looked through this compendium, trying to see what themes, what aspects of psychology did Muslim scholars actually explore, right? Wondering if there was place for religion and spirituality in the way Muslims tackled mental health in the past. And then I'm going to share with you some of the findings that I found to answer my question, was it always the case? Was there no psychology before? Was there no psychology that reconciled spirituality and religiosity? And then some remarkable examples started coming my way. For example, Imam al-Balkhi, in Balkhi's book, Masalih al-Abdan wal-Anfus, Sustenance of the Soul or the Psyche. And he has full chapters on anger, sadness, obsessions, and giving some cognitive and behavioral recommendations. But that's one example. Then you see the examples of Ibn Sina and Al-Razi, more the physician side of things. And there Al-Qanun and Al-Hawi fi al-Tibb. They have entire chapters on psychological symptoms. And Al-Razi has an entire book called Al-Tibb al-Ruhani, where he explores psychological phenomena and emotional phenomena and moral phenomena and so on. But that's only one example as well. Then you look through the history of Muslims and how they established hospitals across the Muslim world, starting in Baghdad in the 7th century. And this is an example in Turkey, Ottoman Turkey, Dar al-Shifa, where if you walk into Dar al-Shifa, and I'm sorry if the screen is not very clear, if you walk into Dar al-Shifa, you'll see a music band, and then you see next to the music band the different maqams, music maqams, and how each maqam can be used therapeutically. So the Rast maqam, for example, it gives psychological relief. The Buzuj maqam, for example, it's used to clear your mind and calm your anxiety, for example, and using aromatherapy and other forms of interventions and therapy. Again, started looking through our tradition, and then I came across books that were titled Al-Adwiya Al-Mufrada, single medications. And you have so many of these written by Thabit ibn Qurra and At-Tamimi, Ibn Sina, Ibn Qadi Ba'labak. And in these books, they describe medications that were used to treat mental health issues, such as Tiryaq al-Faruq was a very common medication that was used back then. Or Jawarishan, which is the long term for this, as they used to call it Miftah al-Surur min kulli al-humum wa mufarrih al-nufus. So that's our SSRI back then. That's our antidepressant, our Prozac back then. But the name was Jawarishan. And they have medications that they called al-mufarrih, al-mulattif, al-murakhi, al-muqawi, medications that bring happiness and pleasure and gentleness and so on, right? And this is just in one type of literature, which is the medications literature. And then explored further, I found books that explored dreams and offered dream interpretations, which is a very significant psychological phenomena. And you have books by Ibn Sirin, Ad-Daynuri, Al-Shihab Al-Abir, Al-Nabulsi. And that's just, again, one domain. And then you explore further and you found scholars such as Al-Ghazali, Tashkubrazada, Bergivi, who wrote about personality traits and virtue ethics and moral psychology. And that's, again, one domain in our literature. And then I moved further while I was doing my master's here in Islamic ethics, and I explored literature such as Akhlaq al-Tabib by Al-Razi, Ethics of the Physician by Al-Razi, or Adab al-Tabib by Abu Ishaq al-Ruhawi, both of which address clinical ethics that apply to the general medical field, but also to mental health and psychology and psychiatry. But again, that's only one domain. And then explored further, and then you came across literature that talked about Riyadat al-Sibyan, Ta'deeb al-Awlad, Siyasat al-Sibyan, child rearing and child development, and treating childhood illnesses and pediatric illnesses, which is, again, a very, very significant psychological domain here in the Islamic literature. Now, putting all this together, and here, this is a picture, just putting all these types of literature, and I just picked a few to give examples of what's out there, what was back then available for Muslims. And if you try to connect this type of literature, all these treatises and books, to the modern fields of psychology and subfields of psychology, you will find some of them are talking about psychotherapy, like Al-Balkhi's works, for example. Some of them are about psychiatry and medications, like Al-Adwiya books and Ibn Sina's and Al-Razi's books. Some of them are showing examples of holistic treatments in psychiatric hospitals in the Muslim community, in the Muslim world. Some of them are about positive psychology and positive traits and moral psychology, such as Al-Ghazali's works and others. Some of them are about dreams and parapsychology. Some of them are about developmental psychology and child rearing. Some of them are about clinical ethics and so on. Discovering the entire spectrum of psychology and psychology subdomains and fields. Now back to our timeline here. So what do we need? Do we just need to feel good? I'm sure many people in the room here feel proud or feel good. But is this what we really need? And a recent paper by Dr. Human and Dr. Amber Haq argued that what we need is not just championing of the historical contributions of Muslims. So what I just did right now was the championing piece, right? But we need to go beyond that, right? We need more sophisticated investigations of the practical applications into modern practice. And that's what Dr. Human is going to talk about. What we need is that the same way Muslims were able to take from the Greek tradition, translate, integrate, create, and present solutions to the problems of the Muslim community back then, we need to be able to do the same and take from that Islamic tradition, take from the modern psychological tradition, empirical truths, and then inform our present practices. What we argue is that we need to bring the soul back to psychology. If you ask anyone what's the meaning of the word psychology, psyche, in Latin, it meant the soul. But then when psychology was established as a scientific field, the soul was taken out. So what Islamic psychology argues is that bringing the soul back into this whole process. And my question to us is, why do we need to do that? Why do we need Islamic psychology? And one answer to this is to be able to answer all the questions I asked you early on in this lecture. This is what we need to conduct research and study Islamic psychology and develop the field to be able to answer all these questions. Some of you raised your hand when I said suicide in the Muslim community is less than other religious groups. There are some papers that are coming out from some Muslim communities in the world where the rates are higher than other religious groups, for example, right? And so on. But also, why do we need Islamic psychology? Because vast literature support the fact that religion and spirituality are associated with positive health outcomes. Because therapies that integrate religiosity and spirituality can be more effective than psychotherapy alone with patients who come from that religious orientation or spiritual orientation. Because Muslims are reluctant to seek mental health treatments than other groups. And this is shown by literature. Multiple studies have shown that. Because Muslims avoid seeking therapy if the therapist is not providing services that are spiritually oriented and attuned. And finally, because many Muslims do not seek mental health care from non-Muslim providers because of cultural and trust issues. So from here, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Human Keshavarzi to walk us through the present and the future of Islamic psychology, inshallah.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله وحده والصلاة والسلام على من لا نبي بعده السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. I'd like to thank all of you all for sparing the time to join us this evening, and all of the respected faculty, esteemed colleagues, as well as the CIS Dean, Dr. Rajab, whom is my teacher and is the one that actually brought me from Chicago to Ibn Khaldun University, and he is the one that has brought me here tonight as well to be with you all today. So mashallah, I congratulate this university for also acquiring somebody of his caliber for the leadership of the university. And Jazakallah khair, Dr. Khalid and Dr. Lombard, for the wonderful introductions. You've made my job very easy tonight. Before I jump in, I just want to mention one thing, and then I want to sort of answer this question of what has contemporary Muslim scholars been doing about this problem. Because Dr. Khalid has mentioned that there was a significant problem here, and that is that he's entering a university and in the medical college, and you have a Muslim that's very antagonistic to religion. And he's inheriting this, right, tradition from the founding fathers of psychology, as he has very eloquently presented. And one additional note that I'll add there is that psychology gets this really advanced push forward when it finds its way into America, into the Americas. And at the inception of the early 1900s of the American Psychological Association, a group of psychologists come together, and they all make a collective decision that we will identify our epistemology as well as our methodology for engaging the field of psychology. And their competition is the hard sciences, is the American Medical Association. And so they decide together that we will distance ourselves from anything to do with metaphysics because it will taint our reputation as scientists. We want to advance a scientific agenda. We want to get recognition from the scientific community, and therefore, all of us who were members, the founding fathers, were members of both the American Psychological Association as well as the Societal for Psychical Research, the SPR. And they engaged in metaphysics, and they decided we will all collectively revoke our memberships with the SPR Association. Why? Because it would taint our reputation. It would taint and go against and at odds with our reductionistic, positivist underlying sort of foundations. And therefore, they made this collective decision, and here comes psychology for the next 100 years until you'll see in the 2000s I'll talk about what starts to change. But the question that we have to ask ourselves, and that Muslim scholars ask themselves around the 70s is, why are we bound by the collective decision of these individuals at a table that we weren't a participating member of? Why does the entire Muslim world have to inherit this model and foundations and parameters and paradigms that have been set forth for the international community when we weren't at that table nor participating members? And that's the question that some contemporary Muslim scholars asked. And in fact, they went on to allege something even further. They said we not only need to rethink psychology, but we really need to represent psychology. And hence, you start the beginning of the Islamization of knowledge project. And this happens in the early 70s. And it starts with a couple of individuals, namely an individual that rises, is sort of the mind of this project is Ismail Farouqi. He himself is, I believe, originally Palestinian, American, studied in the US, and starts to travel many places in the world. And he sets up the IIIT, the International Institute for Islamic Thought, registered in the US, but finds its academic home at the International University or Islamic University in Malaysia, IIUM. And what they do is they make a claim, and they say, and this is part of it, that using the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, الحكمة ضالة المؤمن فإنما تجدها فهو أحق بها. That hikmah is the lost commodity of the believer, and wheresoever he finds it, he is most entitled to it. Meaning that we can take modern psychology, but we are most entitled to it. Why? Because we need to rethink psychology and reconnect the disconnect from the creator, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the human being and the psyche and his nature, and why are we disconnecting it from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And so they feel that we are most entitled to inherit knowledge, and we don't reject empirical knowledge, but we need to situate it within an Islamic framework. So the Islamization of knowledge project begins, and here are the stages that are articulated by the committee headed by Ismail Farouqi, who commissions this project. And here are the stages that they lay out. They say, look, what we need to do for the sciences, be it political science, sociology, psychology, they say we need to master and survey the current modern discipline. Next step, we need to master and analyze the Islamic tradition, just like Dr. Khalid mentioned, right? Look at the rich tradition. Then we need to look at those aspects of our tradition, as he very eloquently presented, that overlap and answer psychological questions or the subject matter questions. Do a critical assessment of that modern field, a creative analysis, and then synthesis. Sometimes the IOK project gets a bad rep for being too fanatical. But in fact, in their own writings, they don't necessarily claim that we're going to do away with all of Western psychology. In fact, it's a critical assessment and a reevaluation and integration. And then to repackage that discipline and to publish textbooks. That was the goal. Now the question is, we're standing here today, 2022, and we're going to look at the effectiveness of this project. What do? They commission the book that Dr. Khalid was most deeply impacted by, as he mentioned, the Ilm al-Nafs fi Turath al-Islami, who was supervised by Dr. Uthman Najati. And Dr. Malik Badri becomes the father of Islamic psychology, the person in psychology who is supported by IIIT and housed at the International University of Malaysia, or Islamic University of Malaysia, and he becomes the representative for the IOK project in psychology. So he's going to be tasked with the responsibility of re-envisioning these stages that I just talked about earlier. And he begins writing and lecturing, and he translates Abu Zayd al-Balkhi's Risala, and it's found right underneath our noses in the early 2000s in the Hagia Sophia Library as a manuscript. that if Fuad Sezgin, rahimahullah ta'ala, had not unearthed this incredible manuscript, he would not have had the access to it nor the opportunity to publish it. And this becomes published. And he writes a very important work in 1979, The Dilemma of Muslim Psychologists, based upon the hadith that if the non-Muslims went into a lizard hole, that the Muslims would follow them into the lizard hole right with them. And so he says, we cannot accept this sort of reductionistic type of science. And so we need to create our own. Dr. Uthman Najati in Egypt, he creates a pathway, a model that's specific to psychology. And you'll notice that its 4 of its stages are exactly the same as the IOK articulation of the project of Islamization of knowledge. And he says we need to create mastery of the modern discipline of psychology, mastery of the Islamic tradition, and then we need to look at the Muslim intellectual heritage, mastery of that. We need to critique modern psychology, and then we need to create Islamically oriented interventions, right? Empirical interventions and theoretical interventions. And then we need to disseminate them and represent them, right? So this is what Uthman Najati says. And this is what they did. And now we'll do a quick critique of it. And what is that? They did a lot. Ismail Faruqi passed away, rahimahullah ta'ala. Malik Badri passed away, last year was it? And you know, I had met him, I benefited from him. He spent the last years of his life in Istanbul, and then he was taken to Malaysia for treatment, and this is where he passed away, rahimahullah ta'ala. And now, the thing that they did, and Malik Badri himself, to his own admission, in my many conversations with him, says that our hope is you, the next generation. What we did was we paved a conversation to be had in an era where people like the likes of Dr. Khalid mentioned would get up and have disdain for psychology. He said, my worst adversaries were Muslims themselves. And he said that wherever I spoke about the need to look in the Islamic tradition, the fiercest pushback I got was from Muslim campuses and colleges and universities and professors and academics. And he says facetiously, he says, I thought to myself, he says this himself, very cute man, you know, when he says this. He says, you know, it occurred to me, why are they getting so upset when I criticize Freud? He says, I realized Freud is writing their checks. He says, they have built their whole legacy on Freud. And now when I tear it down, he says, what do we have? What are we going to teach? What are we going to use for treatment? So you've ripped the foundations from underneath us. And so when you hit them in your pockets, you hit them worst. And so he says, now I understood why they were so antagonistic. But what we had, and he mentions, what did we do, to his own admission in psychology, is that we created an appreciation for Islamic psychology. We created conventions and conferences and translations and this, you know, this 3-volume set. And we had these conversations, and we really got the conversation going. Now he says, your job to build it. Now he says, your guys' job is to build the models. And that's where we are today. And, you know, we wrote this paper in 2020. And the question is, though, in order to build, what do you need? Because building something is not easy. What are the essential ingredients? Well, the challenge that we have in the field is that you have Islamic studies people, they don't know psychology. And then you have psychologists, they don't know Islamic studies. And we're in a space where there's intersectionality. You need to be able to bring both together at the table. And so what do we do about this dilemma? And so, you know, in this paper, we articulate the need for Muslim psychologists to develop competencies in Islamic studies. And similarly, we need Islamic scholars to be able to become more Islamically minded. And if you have the rare scenario where you have a couple of people, like somebody like Dr. Khalid, who can possess the capacity to do both, housed potentially, you know, just as a suggestion, a hint, housed at a place like CIS, then you may end up having a space to create the competencies to build the field. Now, in our review, we did a 10-year review in 2016 of the field of all of the literature that we could find on Islam and psychology. And we wanted to see what are the trends, where is the areas where there's a lot of literature and where are there gaps. And what we found is that number 3 and 4, we found there was publications in these 5 themes. Number 3 and 4 was significantly lacking. Number 1, it was basically the appreciation. Right, sorry, not the appreciation. One was you take psychoanalysis or behaviorism and you say it's actually Islamic, so you throw some Quran and Hadith underneath it. And you say Freud, id means nafs, ego means nafs lawama, nafs mutmainna is superego, whatever. You sort of create this way of being able to spin something that's not rooted in Islam, giving it some Islamic basis for it. Number 2 was a lot of the work that was done by those that preceded us, and there's a lot of literature on what? On translations, the need to look in the past, looking at and appreciating the Islamic literature. Number 3 and 4 is lacking. Theoretical models and practical interventions. Okay? And number 5, we have some scales. There's a lot more, but the 3 and 4 were lacking. So then what did Muslims do? What did we do in 2016? We thought, look, we're lacking this. We need to do something about this. And this is where we come to the present state of psychology. And I'll just describe to you this immense explosion of interest in this topic of psychology. And I'll tell you a little bit in a minute as to why there's so much interest. But we find a couple of institutions coming together to form interest and do work on Islamic psychology. Number 1, in 2010, the organization that I'm affiliated with in the US is the Khalil Center. And I'll describe it in a minute. 2014 at Stanford University, there's a Muslim mental health lab in Islamic psychology by one of our colleagues who was also working at Khalil Center develops. In 2017 at the University of Southern California, there's a Muslim mental health and Islamic psychology center. 2018, there's a creation of a IEIP. Actually, the president was Malik Badri himself. He said, now the time is right to be able to develop kind of the field. And so he sets that up. The Al-Karam Institute in the US, the creation of the ISIP, Students of Islamic Psychology, right? And Cambridge Muslim College creates a diploma. Ibn Khaldun University that I went to in 2018, 2022, puts in an application for a Center for Islamic Psychology Research. And 2022, there's also in Turkey other institutes that are developing, interested in the subject of psychology. I'll talk about the work that we've done to answer the question of the theoretical void, right? And so what we did, we said, look, we need to be able to look at understanding human psychology from an inherently Islamic perspective. So we did a review through a work group of Islamic literature that has to do with the nature of the psyche and the nature of the human being. And then we sort of created a model out of this, and then we started to build interventions that fit under that framework and model. And this is one of the few, if not only, structured articulations of a model of Islamic psychotherapy that's inherently derived from the classical Islamic traditions and effectively integrates modern methods and psychology, or creates a mechanism for being able to integrate modern psychology. And I don't have enough time to describe that. I teach a course on this at Ibn Khaldun. I teach 2 courses, intro and advanced, and then we train our students and we have supervisions. And so now for the past 2 years, we've been doing this at the Sulaimaniya campus. Again, an opening that Dr. Rajab facilitated for us at the Sulaimaniya Historic Madrasa. And we've housed level 1 and level 2 trainings in what we call traditional Islamically integrated psychotherapy. We've published a book and some manuals on how to do this. And so this is sort of starting to try to answer the question and to build the frames and models. In 2010, tell you a little bit about Khalil Center. We started the Khalil Center. Khalil Center is now the largest provider of Muslim mental health services across the country and in the continent. We have more than 50 clinicians. We have a training program that's also an accredited pre-doctoral training program. People go from universities, come to our sites in order to practice and learn Islamic psychology. What do? We have our clinics where we do psychotherapy. We also facilitate research and gather data and analysis on the models that we're working on. And then we do community education, so marriage and parenting and well-being. We go out into the masajid and into the community, and we give workshops and we develop content on this in order to uplift the community. Here are the offices across North America. And now I'm going to answer this question. How is it that there's so much interest? What's the context for all of this interest? Why is all this explosion of research and institutes coming forward? Well, one of which is the field has changed. I described to you the foundations of the field. Psychology is changing. Psychology is starting to move and break out of the shackles of Eurocentric positivism. And it's starting to understand and appreciate that our models of care that are built are not going to work on certain populations. Not to mention that practicing devout, faithful people, be they Christians or Jews or Muslims or Buddhists, are starting to push back. And they're saying we cannot exclude values from the mental health encounter. We cannot exclude human beings' interpretations of the world. What do we work on in psychology? We work on belief, right? We work on behavior. We work on emotions. All of these areas, religion has something to say about, right? And so whether we want to exclude it or not, the patient will not exclude it. And therefore, there's an acknowledgement that we need to do this. And by the way, they started to do it already. So Harold Koenig, for example, at Georgetown University, is Georgetown, is it? Duke University has commissioned the RCBT project, religiously oriented CBT. And so before Muslims could jump on the project, they created a Muslim manual using Quran and Hadith to treat certain disorders, right? If you look at Martin Seligman has written Character, Strengths, and Virtues, in which he drew from the akhlaq literature of the Muslim traditions, right? And so the question is, where are the Muslims to do this? So the environment has become much more open for this kind of thing, where the APA president in 2016, and by the way, 2017, 18, and 2002, for the first time ever, they create an Islamic psychology panel in which I was on all three of them, right? So for 3 years, right, in the past 5 years, they've opened a conversation for Islamic psychology on a panel. And at the American Psychiatric Association, which I was on a panel, first time in its over 100-year history, they had a clergyman, and guess what? That was a Muslim from a religious consultant from our office at that panel. So they've opened up the conversation, and now there's a call for papers in American Psychological Association paper or journal. And so Susan McDaniel says, this time, she says, look, these countries have some of the most advanced civilizations in human history, with philosophies that do not always fit with the tenets of Western psychology. All psychology is cross-cultural. It can be challenging to avoid projecting our own values and intentions in science and practice. The commitment is clear: to develop a psychology that incorporates Western science and Eastern philosophies. However, not everything important is verifiable through our scientific methodology. This is a challenge because some of the assumptions of Western models do not fit the Eastern experience. And we, John Templeton Foundation gave a grant for spiritually integrated psychotherapies, $1.8 million. We were a part of that large 22-site project, and we brought the Muslim manual forward and did the empirical evidence trial for this, with the intention of this huge group to try to gain acceptance and to classify spiritually integrated psychotherapies as mainstream. And one of the births of that is that there is a publication on spiritually integrated psychotherapies of the APA manual, that's published by APA, and our chapter is featured in it. In fact, it's the first chapter that comes under the religious traditions, denominational approaches, because he himself, Scott Richards, who I know very well, said this is the most structured articulation of a religiously oriented psychotherapy. So they wanted to kind of feature it first as a good example. And so there's this, interest, and I'll jump quickly to the future because the future is, short. The future is yours, actually. The future is for us to co-create. And so what do we need? Well, Islamic psychology needs an academic home, right? And it really doesn't have one currently. And there are many challenges to the creation of an academic home. And so there's another sort of hint about the possibility of a university like this housing and creating a home for Islamic psychology. But the literature needs further development. It needs scales, it needs manuals, it needs further classics and translation projects, it needs empirical studies, and it needs, eventually what I envision is that we will write the textbook on psychology. And it will be, and we don't need to attach the term Islam on it anymore. At a certain point, it will be, because when they made the decision in the early 1900s, they didn't attach anything to it. They said this is psychology. But if we can create the better alternative, right, to a uniplex, to borrow Dr. Rajab's words, and research, to a more multiplex psychology where these traditions are embedded within it, then we're going to create a better training manuals and textbooks for teaching that will be widely available for the entire Muslim world to use. Think about the immense power of that. Think about all of these psychology programs across 2 billion Muslims and the availability of universities that they have and where they're going. And then extend beyond that to then make it widely accessible and available for all 6 billion people across the world. That would be a worthwhile project. And so these are just some of our trainings we've done. We're doing it, APA is supporting this training, by the way, in Chicago. I'm actually going there in October to do this. We did this training in Pakistan. We've been doing it in Istanbul. And there's a number of symposiums and conferences that are interested in this topic now, one of which Dr. Rajab was the person behind it, the thought action towards a multiplex relational theory of action, right? A symposium that was also funded by Templeton Foundation, in which we had a series of discussions on psychology. And here are our publications. Here are some of our publications. This is more of our model that we call traditional Islamically integrated psychotherapy, lays out the foundations for an application of a psychotherapy. And then here's a specific model which we envision more will come in application specifically to the treatment of OCD, inshallah ta'ala. So, and that's where I conclude. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.
All right, well, thank you very much to both of our distinguished guests. Now, what we'd like to do now is to open up the floor for a few questions, inshallah. And so I will be moderating that. Now, since we are all a male panel up here, I think the first thing we're going to do is take questions from a few of the female participants in the audience, especially as many of you know, the field of psychology is one that actually has more women in it than men. And so we hope to be able to open up to questions that the audience may have. So please, do we have any microphones to go around? I can't see. I got the. Oh yes, here we go. All right, so I've got to step out of the light so I can see who's asking a question. Does anybody have a question? Yes, up here. I'm told that seat mics are actually working today. Some days they don't work. What's that? Yes. Can we turn off the lights? What is it? Can we turn off the lights?
It's فراسة اتقوا فراسة المؤمن فإنه ينظر بنور الله.
You can use the
You don't
mic
need
in
the
front
lights.
of you.
Hello. Oh, hi. It was an honor to be here, and I'm very grateful for hearing your talk. It was so amazing and very inspiring. I have a question regarding Islamic psychology in education. So, as you may know, of course, so many Muslim students are enrolling in psychology, and I'm wondering how far off do you think we are from implementing our version of psychology into education?
But by education, do you mean like education studies?
Yes,
Right?
textbooks, things like that.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
I see. Like Psych 101 textbooks and these kinds
Yeah.
of things, what you're talking about. I don't think we're that far off. It requires sort of an assembly of a commission of individuals to come together to actually write these works. If you look at the example of Imam al-Ghazali, right, for example, who writes the Rudud on the Batiniya, Ismailiyya, the philosophers, for example, right? He is commissioned by Nizam al-Mulk of the Seljuk dynasty, right? And he gets appointed as the chief professor at the Baghdad Madrasa Nizamiya. And one of his projects that he does is to take the pen and to author and write these things down. And so there needs to be a sort of a commitment and an endorsement for sitting down at a table where scholars will be in conversation with one another to create it. I don't think we're that far off. I think we do have few human resources in this arena, admittedly, but I think we have some strong human resources that if they were put to sort of the task, taking away, I don't know, all of the other burdens of responsibilities to be able to do something like that, it's conceivable. Now, I think this is an iterative process, meaning that it's already begun, and inshallah it's an inevitability, meaning that the students in which I'm hosting, chairing many of their dissertations, are doing pieces of this puzzle, right? So they're doing clinical trials in some cases, theoretical scales, etc. So it's an evolving process. I don't think we're that far away, and I would imagine, within 5 to 10 years, maybe even shorter, we should be able to really develop our own manual. If you took or if you took Psych 101 and you had developmental psychologists and Islamic studies people sit together and write that chapter, and you had abnormal psychology and you had experts in that arena sit down and really think about and derive and write that chapter, I think you would be quite, we already have a lot of great minds in our community. We have a lot of resource talent within our Muslim community. It's just about creating the structure to be able to develop it. That's my
Inshallah.
belief.
Thank you so much.
And just a quick comment. Dr. Human talked about the books, the textbooks, and so on. But if you're asking about training and education, some of the organizations that Dr. Human listed earlier, like International Association of Islamic Psychology, the Cambridge Muslim College, and others, are offering some online diplomas that people can train in until Hamad bin Khalifa University launches its department, inshallah, in the future.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Jazakallah khair, for the talk today. It was very informative. My question is related to the fact that there is a movement of people from different religions finding alternative ways to heal and to kind of incorporate psychology. As I'm learning, like on my own, I'm just cautious of learning things that are actually wrong. Because people have like Buddhism and things like that. They have their own understanding of the soul and the metaphysical. Do you have any advice on like how to handle that, how to stay away from things like that might seem a bit scary and you don't know where it fits in Islam?
I think Yeah. فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. I feel like the only way is to really run these approaches and interventions or ideas by people who have mastered perhaps both the mental health field as well as the Islamic kind of sciences, and kind of get some input and feedback. That's the only way I think of going about. Dr. Human?
Yeah, I agree. Mentorship, supervision, asking those who sort of know the field.
Take Dr. Human's email and ask him.
You might not get a response. You may as well take his.
Dr. Lombard, it might help if anyone speaking just your name and maybe background, if you're in the mental health field, just interested in psychology and Islam in general, just your profession, any just word about your background would be helpful, inshallah.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Kareem, can you hear
Please,
me?
yeah, we can hear, yes.
Yes. It's okay. Is it working?
It's working, okay.
Yeah.
You can hear me? Okay. Both the speakers for opening this topic, which is very interesting, and we need it today, in fact. As I understand, Islamic psychology is the science of spiritual health. And when we talk of about psychology, we shouldn't start, or we shouldn't keep the Western model in front of us and begin from there. We have to start from our own sources, Quran and Sunnah. I think that is what you are trying to do, and that is well appreciated. But still, we feel that we are trying to find parallels and trying to have conversation with the Western tradition. That is good, but still, we have a very rich tradition, as you people mentioned. And a full-fledged psychology is there after Quran and Sunnah, or it was drawn from the Quran and Sunnah and Sirah of the Prophet ﷺ in the 3rd century Hijrah and the 2nd century Hijrah. So I want to see names like Muhasibi. I want to see names like Abu Sulaiman al-Darani, who was called as a spy of the heart in our tradition. And we have a very, where is Hakim al-Tirmizi, and where are all those people who were, you see, today we are talking about bhakti, about yoga, and people are being attracted toward all these philosophies coming from the east or west. But the Islamic tradition, the practices we have in our tradition is being completely ignored sometimes even by those who are advocating for Islamic psychology. Those who, I have been reading Islamic psychologists too, and I find that they are trying to, like the Islamization of knowledge in the field of social science, social science. I think it's a failed project, because they were taking Western sociology and trying to add Quran, verse from the Quran, verse from the Sunnah here and there, and call it Islamic sociology. And I don't want that Islamic psychology will be the same. I hope that it begins from the Quran and from the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and from that it draws from that rich tradition which we had from the beginning of Islamic history, especially in the 2nd and 3rd century tradition, spiritual tradition of Islam. We can benefit from that, but we shouldn't start from this Western, tradition. We can benefit from their practical findings and discoveries. That is my humble desire or suggestion. Thank you very much.
Just to comment on that, I agree with you, by the way. I agree with you entirely. Everything you said, I agree with everything entirely. So I just want to reiterate that.
You see, when I was studying psychology in 1978, my professor said the same thing to which you refer. He said, "Ilm al-nafs al-mu'asir, ilm al-nafs biduni nafs." Yes, he taught us like that, and really I experienced it.
So just a quick comment on what you said, and I think it's an important note that you make. The IOK project, the Islamization of knowledge project, its aspirations and its products are different, what I mean by that is that the aspirations, because initially I too was very critical on the basis of the products, because the products are very, I don't want to say anything because these are our seniors, but some of whom have been written to the exclusion of somebody like Malik Badri, I would say, but they just touch the surface, right? And I think the problem was because of the fact that the idea is so novel. Like the aspirations are huge, but the ability to actualize what they intended to do, like you'll see this in a lot of publications where the actual project itself doesn't become realized as it should. And I believe part of the reason for that is because we lack the human resources to be able to actually do it. So we're endeavoring to do an aspirational project whereby psychologists can't access the Turath, and then the Islamic studies people are not able to bring these concepts to answer psychological questions, right? And so I agree with you entirely, but I think your observation of the sort of failed projects, I think is more at the level of execution rather than aspiration. Like they aspired for what you're exactly saying, but they may not have been able to realize it. Yeah.
I have two questions. First one, what is controversial topic we have instead of only a connection with Allah? It's the difference between Islamic psychology and the other field. That's one question, or there is other topic, it's make differentiation between them. The other topic, the other question is about the interdisciplinary approach, because Ibn Khaldun said interdisciplinary is from fitra. Do you think also connection with other fields, it's also it's mandatory? It's not only with Islam, with management, with education, with all these topics, it must have Islamic psychology inside it, embedded or not? Thank you.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understood the first question. Can you repeat that?
It's about the high. Can you answer the interdisciplinary approach and the connection with Allah? You said is cutting between Islamic psychology. There is connection with Allah, with the spirit, but the other field is there is not have that spirit. What other topic also make differentiation between Islamic psychology and other psychology?
I think that, as Dr. Homan earlier described, so that the foundations of the field of psychology are very different from the foundations of any religious tradition. They completely distance themselves from the soul and from metaphysics and from religion and spirituality and so on, while the foundations of Islam are obvious to people here in the room. And in terms of the interdisciplinary, like the implications of psychology are into every field, right? There are so many subdomains of psychology. There's health psychology, developmental psychology, gender and sexuality, organizational psychology. So the implications are far-reaching, but we are kind of, again, the field has been around for 40, 50, 60 years, so we are kind of just collecting the human resources and the organizational resources in order to start this process and develop the programs and training programs, and the future students in master's degrees and PhD programs can develop their own dissertations and areas of interest, and then we can have further areas of concentration in these programs and so on that feed into all these different disciplines. So I totally agree with your suggestion.
There's a gentleman up here who has the mic, and then Dr. Osman.
Thank you so much for a very informative lecture. I have actually a couple of questions, if you're like the time allow. So basically, what is the stance of Islamic practitioners when acclimatizing the whole Western concept of psychology when it comes to subjects or matters which does not really align entirely with Islamic values and cultures?
Yeah, I think, Dr. Can you remind me of your names? Dr. Dean. Dr. Dean kind of, I think maybe in his comment, sort of addressed, almost answered your question, and that is that, rather than accommodation psychology, meaning that we're trying to accommodate Islam within psychology, the current field of psychology, what we need to do is go back to the drawing table and to ask, what is psychology? What is the psyche as identified by the Quran and Sunnah, as described by the inheritors of the prophets who have asked these very questions and attempted to provide answers. And you'll find many rich literature that attempts to answer that question. Once you sort of build that foundation, right, then فرعها في السماء, right? Then basically everything else will fall into order. Because the usul of the deen, really what draws all of these scholars together, is their ability to differentiate and to categorize and to place things in their appropriate space and place. And I think that's one of the important things of being able to impart upon and to bring into psychology, is a capacity to be able to give some foundations to the way that we think as Muslims. You know, like Dr. Rajab has this comparative methods class, right? Help you understand how to think and evaluate information. And I think that's essential. And once you do that, then you bring that same usul to the subject matter of psychology. And then you can deal with all of these, like all these questions that emerge outside of it. Like, how do you understand somebody who has an alternative lifestyle? Or how do you understand somebody who has gender disorder, gender identity? These are all furu', right? Furu'at, right? These are all like questions. But once you create a framework for being able to understand how to think about these problems, then you're able to sort of situate or give responses to each of these questions. Does that make sense?
If I might add or rephrase this question in a contemporary manner, you know, with the modern psychology, you know, with new diagnoses and like, you know, potential, what we call it, you know, introducing new diagnoses and removing others. So when it comes to the new generation and like young and adolescent patient, some of these values impose a really major existential, you know, matters. So from Islamic standpoint, I'm not like really sure if that has been considered or addressed, you know, as it's really lies in the interface, you know, between, you know, Islam and like stuff which might be a little bit not entirely compatible with like Islamic practices in general.
Yeah, I mean, this is more of a application practitioner-based sort of training, meaning like how do you deal with patients that come to you that may have existential questions. So one of the things that you may be wondering is, how does Islamic psychology deal with a Muslim who's not very practicing or is not Islamically oriented or isn't interested in hearing about all these Islamic terminologies and concepts, right? Yeah. When we say Islamic psychology, we don't necessarily mean that everybody walks around telling everybody this is haram, do this, do that, or don't do this, right? There's a sophistication in the way that you deal with individuals that is derived from the prophetic seerah itself, right? Did the Prophet ﷺ tell everybody, like, how did he deal with people? He gave different answers to different people on the basis of their contexts, right? You know, Ali radiallahu anhu says that the alim is not the person who arbitrarily makes an individual fear the wrath of Allah, nor do they make them feel secure from the wrath of Allah. Rather, يستعمل ما كان لائقا لكل حال مريض, that he uses whatever is appropriate to the situation of every patient. أمرت أن أكلم الناس على قدر عقولهم. So then you speak to individuals in a manner that you're going to be able to engage with them. And there's, you know, as we were having dinner yesterday and Dr. Rajab had brought up the adab al-bahth wal-munadhara wal-bahth. Like, how do you talk to somebody in a way that isn't mujadala, you're like arguing with them, but you're able to co-construct and collaborate and to reason together in a way of being able to find effective solutions to problems.
Because I know Dr. Ahmed works in a clinical context, and what you're referring to in the clinical context, Ahmed, I think is value conflicts, how to manage and navigate value conflicts between myself as a clinician and patients. And in the ethical literature, they discuss whether doctors can impose their own values, or do they have to give unconditional regard and respect to patients' values and so on? And it's not only in the psychiatry field, it's not only in psychiatry, but across the medical field. For example, questions of abortion, for example, raise similar value conflicts. So there's rich literature on this topic, and Dr. Human and I actually published a paper on navigating these value conflicts. But as Dr. Human said, there's an element of wisdom, awareness of our limitations as well. If you are working in a country where it's illegal, for example, to offer certain interventions, then you are aware of these legal limitations as well. If that country does not work for you, you have to find a country where the legal limitations allow you to practice in a way that's in line with your own values, right? Again, awareness of our limitations, the legal context, the wisdom that Dr. Human talked about in doing al-ma'ruf and nahi al-munkar, for example, right? So I hope this kind of touches.
Thank you so much, both. And that will drive. Oh.
We have multiple people who have questions here. So what we're going to do now, since we've got
Sorry, I took much of your time. Thanks, you both.
We've got 10 minutes left. So we're going to ask Dr. Osman to ask his question, but then we'll try to swing it up here and allow some of our other participants over here, and to ask them multiple questions. So get your pens and paper out so that we can try to wrap this all up and not tire you too much with your generosity. Please, Dr. Osman.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you very much. Very informative and very interesting session. My name is Mustafa Osman Al-Amin, staff member of the CIS here. I started my career as clinician and then political science, and then end up now teaching Islam and global affairs. It seemed to me Muslim clinicians, when they treat their patients, especially mental patients, they use Islamic psychology. But they didn't know that this is Islamic psychology. They know that this is part of teaching, treatment. It can, but they didn't know that. Of course, in the past, scholars like Abu Bakr al-Razi, like Ibn Sina, they are both clinician and psychologist. In the modern time, especially our earlier scholars like Malik Badri and Dr. Osman Tijani and Ismail Farouqi, I don't know whether they have a clinician background or they are psychologists. So it seemed to me the challenge now will be how to link, as you said, this the clinical work with the psychological work to make Islamic clinical psychology, so that we can make it, instead of more or less locally, it will be globally, and it will be globally endorsed. And this is the interesting thing. So this is how I understand it now. The second point, maybe it's already there. I feel that scholars like Malik Badri, Ismail Farouqi, Osman Tijani, maybe here, CIS, HBKU could have started it. If we can make a sort of an annual award. So each year there will be award. We call for papers for the best Islamic clinical psychology, and then this will, of course, it will make it more deeper and deeper, but this could be also part of what CIS HBK is going to do in the future, inshallah. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.
It's my turn. Very good. I'm Sharif Amor from Virginia Commonwealth University here at Qatar. Dr. Human and Khalid, thank you so much for these enlightening presentations. It's wonderful. It's really a desperately needed body of knowledge that we need in these current times. There is no doubt about it. I was so pleased to hear you using the terminology of epistemology and methodologies, which really took me to feel that you're developing a new paradigm. And then an interesting kind of reference came to mind, a book that I read earlier from Thomas Kuhn, who wrote a very nice kind of, it's a seminal work in most universities about teaching, research methodologies and adding to the body of knowledge. And he was questioning one big question, the whole book. It was written in the 60s. The question was about when you're adding a new paradigm, you're adding I would say, a new body of knowledge. Would you adopt a methodology that he called pseudoscience or science? And he called pseudoscience the following. He called pseudoscience anything that is existing and just refurbishing it and adding to it, or a scientific approach where you're neglecting totally what has been there, nullifying all the theories and methodologies that were there, and you're adding really a new body of knowledge. And this would require a huge effort. This is my first, perhaps, question or comment for my brothers for future reflection. The second one, when we talk about psychology, we have a tendency to limit ourselves to behavior. How I feel, what is happiness, what is anxiety, what is. But in reality, there is another component that we need to pay attention, which is the environment. Because particularly nowadays, the environment has a huge impact on our behavior. So it's not only, of course, the body of Islamic knowledge is huge, but the environments in which we live are very important. Like, for example, the lighting in here was not great, so it created for me stress on how to read this beautiful lecture that you have. So it's a good example of psychology. So it's an environmental condition that has an impact on how we perceive, how we feel, and so on and so forth. Thank you so much. I really appreciated your presentations. Thank you.
We have so many people. So this gentleman up here has had his hand up several times, and I think I apologize everyone, but that's going to be all that we'll have time to answer. And then we can talk more afterwards.
This guy,
yes,
right?
This gentleman.
Good evening. Thank you so much for the informative session. My name is Khalid. I'm a training psychiatrist. I will try to limit my comment to 2 questions. First of all, yes, I do believe that religion and science are different, but that in itself does not mean one is superior to the other. They both try to answer questions, albeit in different manners. So how can we reconcile or integrate an Islamic tradition and within the realm of religion into what we're trying to do now in terms of evidence-based practice, and like integrating the tradition and the legacy we have within the scientific methodology? That's number one. And the second question is, whenever the topic of religion and clinical encounter especially is brought up, we like a lot of people tend to look at it at the two-edged sword, that it could potentially have negative consequences in that particular encounter with a certain patient, for example, who is not religious or does not practice religion. So is there any work done, in terms of like framework or ethical guidelines that could potentially limit and guard against these potential, what do you call it? Yes, negative consequences. Thank you.
I would invite you to all, I think we're going to have refreshments out here, and we can continue the conversation after that. So please.
Thank you so much. And for the comments, I thank you so much for the beautiful comments. I totally agree with the comments. For the questions posed by Dr. Khalid, I think I'm just going to briefly touch upon the second part, which is in clinical encounters. And I feel like you are bringing a very, very important point on being self-aware in these clinical encounters of imposing our own values, knowing that even when we're talking about Islamic psychology, within the Islamic tradition, every Muslim patient you see comes from a very, very different place, right? We don't all adhere to the same beliefs and worldviews, and there are different sects and different levels of practice and adherence to different levels of rituals in the Islamic tradition. We don't assume that every single patient who walks in prays 5 times a day or fasts Ramadan or wears hijab and so on, right? So the etiquettes of managing these differences, whether from an Islamic perspective or a clinical, ethical perspective, are very, very important to keep in mind. And again, I would refer you back, if you're looking for some guidelines, I think the paper that Dr. Human and I wrote laid out maybe 4 or 5 main approaches or ways to reconcile in these value conflict situations in clinical encounters. But overall, I think if you always err on the side of wisdom, on the side of holding back, on the side of building rapport, on the side of not imposing your values, on the side of I'm not sure what to do here, and then I'll seek supervision and seek consultation, you're always safer if you err on this side than erring on the side of imposing my own values and wanting to convert patients and so on, right? So always err on that side rather than on the other side, if this makes sense. Yeah. Would you like to comment on the question of how do we establish evidence-based practices?
Yeah, I mean, this issue of, there's just a lot of unpackaging of terminologies that you mentioned that needs to be sort of discussed that we don't have time to get into. How do we define evidence-based practice? Well, what is evidence, for example? These are important things to talk about. How do we qualify the parameters of a religion and psychology? Is psychology a science or is it a religion? That's also another question. And so we get into, I'll pose further questions just to demonstrate the complexity, but I won't necessarily answer it. But it's more complicated than we think it is in terms of the clean separation between a religion and a science. The Quran tells us, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu ijtanibu kathiran min adh-dhann inna ba'da adh-dhann ithm. Right? The Quran tells us how to think. Right? The Quran tells us how to believe. What does CBT do? Tell you what to think, what to believe. Changing your beliefs is one of the core mechanisms of psychological healing, right? When we're talking about thinking, we're talking about behavior. The Quran tells us how to behave. من عمل صالحا من ذكر أو أنثى وهو مؤمن فلنحيينه حياة طيبة. Right? The Quran is telling us how to behave. And if you behave a certain way, you'll have حياة طيبة, right? A good life. So then what about emotions, right? The Prophet ﷺ said, لا تغضب, right? لا تحزن إن الله معنا. All of these ayat about huzn and ham, etc. The Quran is telling us how to feel, right? So I'm just posing to you sort of a illustration that it's not that easy. Another example I'll give you about evidence-based practice. Again, why it's not so simple. Because evidence-based practice has evolved in psychology. Initially, starting off with the hard sciences, it was based in behaviorism, which means anything you see and do, which means you can only measure behavior, right? So according to the hard scientific method, if you can't see thoughts. Since you can't see thoughts, they don't exist. And how do you measure thinking? How do you measure behaviors? You have to ask people. When you ask people, what do you end up with? What we call subjective self-report, which means it's not objective scientific data. It's now a realm of the subjectivity. So if we're able to gauge and ask people about their subjective experiences, where do you draw the line? You open the door, you can't close it now. And psychology has adopted in the APA 2006 publication on evidence-based practice, they've included case studies, process outcome studies. Subjective self-reports are the cornerstone and almost the majority of psychological data. And this is why the hard sciences don't accept psychology as a science. They'll say it's a pseudoscience, right? If you go by the hard science, at best it's survey data. Meaning, what's survey data? It's interesting, right? But you can't call it fact, right? And then there's also another dichotomy we have to fix. That is, when we say mental health conditions, are they rooted in the body or are they rooted in the psyche? Because they're different, right? Is a person experiencing psychosis? Why are they experiencing psychosis? If a person is experiencing depression, is this a chemical imbalance and it's heritable and that's the root of it? Or is it because of the fact that it's environmental factors, belief, social modeling, environment, right? And we know that when things are psychologically based, there's overwhelming data that religious interventions are helpful, right? We know gratitude helps, patience helps, character improves people's marriages, right? Improves people's job performances, personal self-satisfaction and happiness, right? So we know that there's a relationship between belief and between these like very spiritual ideas and the outcomes on mental health. But the question is, how do we answer these? I'm not answering them for you. I'm posing to you complications, right? That breaks a lot of these very clean sort of, this is a science, this is a religion, this is this, this, that. We need more sophisticated ways of being able to do that. And my belief is that you can answer these through the usul of a multiplex kind of framework to approach psychology. If you bring scholars that know this and know the methodologies and can engage these questions, they'll be able to really provide, hopefully, very satisfactory answers to these problems. And just to, about the paradigm shift, it's similar to what I just mentioned. It's not so much a new paradigm that we're establishing, rather that it's a tajdid al-mu'assal. So it's a repackaging of something that's already ingrained within the tradition. So the only paradigms that you see that are timeless are the ones that are built on the usul al-din, and that's the one that we allege very confidently to say that that has stood the test of time. That you can take, because it's rahmatul lil alameen, it's timeless, right? It's not for a community, it's for the entire humanity across all time. And the scholars of Islam are perhaps the only tradition that has had the ability to withstand the test of time in being able to answer very modern questions across generations using the same usul that united them from the beginning of Islam until today.
Through and do this, alhamdulillah. And as I said before, we are having refreshments out here. Please, all of you join us. And I do apologize again for everyone whose questions we were not able to field. But we plan to have more of these events regarding Islamic psychology. So please do come back, and I hope that we're able to field your questions next time, inshallah. Thank you again.